Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and welcome to tonight's live edition of Behind the Headlines with you here on British Muslim TV, Sky Channel 752. We're also online, britishmuslim.tv, with me, Ahmad Bostan, on this amazing Friday night with you till the hours of 8 p.m. Those of you who are regular viewers of the program will know that each and every week we interview an inspirational guest, an inspirational participant to motivate us in terms of their life story, their journey, the ups, the downs, that's been good, that's been not so good, and it's all with a view to inspiring you. Your participation is, of course, more than welcome at any point in the program, so please do get in touch with us. You can call in live on 01924 231 083. That's our studio number. You can send us a WhatsApp. You can even contact us on Twitter. And you know what? You can even do Facebook. Now, how is that for contact means? You've got a big variety there to choose from. Now, I'm absolutely honored and delighted that today my guest is someone who wears many hats. He is a renowned academic, a journalist, a commentator, someone who has been at the heart of some of the biggest international events in this time. Professor Scott Lucas is a professor of international relations. He was at the University of Birmingham for many years. He's editor of EA Worldview, which is an acclaimed journal on the Middle East and has live updates on various events. Many of you will recall the uprising in Iran. They documented that live, the Syrian Civil War, and various other international events. Professor Scott Lucas has been an academic for many decades, previously a professor of American and Canadian politics, and still so, and I'm delighted to say that he is my guest this evening. A very warm welcome to Behind the Headlines, Professor Scott Lucas. It's an honor to have you with us.
Assalamu alaikum. The honor is mine, Ahmed. It's really mine.
Wa alaikum salam. Now, we are very used to speaking to you about unfolding international events, as sadly bombs are falling down in places, death and destruction, wars, conflicts. But today, I want to go right to the very beginning, Professor Scott Lucas. Where did your epic journey begin?
Well, I should start after that introduction, Ahmed, by thanking you and your viewers for being inspirational to me. Because before we talk about my journey, where I am now in 2021 is that I've learned so much from our discussions. I've learned so much from the input of viewers in what has been really a shift in my perspective from someone who grew up in the United States, who came to the UK, but very much looked on many parts of the world from the outside until I was really introduced to it by those folks of you who are from India or from Pakistan, or people who are from the Middle East or from Iran. I was born in the middle of the Cold War. That was my experience in a city called Huntsville, Alabama. Now, I'm not sure if many folks have heard of Huntsville, Alabama, but our claim to fame is we were on the top 10 list of sites that would be bombed in a nuclear war by the Soviets, because that's where rockets were made. Now, those rockets were like rockets that went to the moon, and we're very proud of that in Huntsville, where I grew up. I was a boy when it happened, when Apollo 11 landed there, and knew it had been made in my hometown. But it was also the place where rockets were made that could blow things up, that could carry nuclear warheads. That part we didn't talk about as much. And I think it was growing up in that Cold War environment that sort of shaped my experience of how I saw the world. And it took many years to begin to change that, to realize that it wasn't just an us versus them, US versus Soviet Union type of contest, something that has really made me think that it's not a cartoon portrayal, but it's just the way you grow up with fairly simple versions of good versus evil, and realizing the world is a richer place, but also a more complex and demanding place than that.
So your passion for politics, your passion for academia, was it something that was rooted in you because of your birth, where you were born from an early age? Did you know or have some idea that, yeah, I'm going to go into academia, I'm going to be a journalist and a voice on these issues? Did you have that in mind?
It was a bit of a journey to get there. I mean, I started off as a journalist at the age of 16 in this town called Huntsville, pretty, town of about 150,000 people. But I was a sports journalist. I love sports. I'm useless at them, but I love covering baseball or basketball or American football or this thing called soccer that I got introduced to in Alabama because we had two very good university teams. And so I thought I might be a sports journalist. My mother wanted me to be a lawyer, and still regrets the fact that I'm not one of those. But I think the path really is that at the age of 18, I had started university in the United States. I didn't really like my university that much. I felt it was kind of constricting. I wanted to see a bit of the world. So it was like, I'm not very good at speaking languages. I can read them very well, but I'm not very good at speaking them. So it was either go for a year to England or Australia. England was closer. And so I wound up in Leeds at the University of Leeds, had a fantastic year there. Still suffer for being a Leeds United fan, for those people who follow soccer ball. But it was at Leeds that I sort of realized, like, there's this whole world out there beyond the United States. And that really was the path to being an academic, that instead of going into the law, I would study the United States, the United Kingdom, and places like the Middle East, and just learn and discuss with people.
And when you started studying and learning more about the cold truth of international relations, of international politics, and even politics of your country of birth, the United States, as well as meeting people from various backgrounds and various walks of life, how did that affect you as a person, as an individual? Do you think that your knowledge base evolved? Were you a bit, I suppose, confused as to where you want to go, because there's so much to learn and so many different paths that you could take as an academic?
Well, I think that's a great question, Ahmed, because I think for many years, and I mean many years into my academic career, and even after I had the honor of becoming a professor, I was still limited in my viewpoint in that I was sort of trained in history and then in politics, but it was very much from a U.S. looking at the world perspective, or a U.S. in the U.K. looking at the world perspective. My first book, and I'm very proud of it, it's about the Suez Crisis of 1956, and there are characters like Jamal Abdel Nasser there, the Egyptian president, and the Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, and obviously this was a very important war in the history of the Middle East, but I still was looking at it as, what did it mean for America? What did it mean for Britain? And I think, even into the 1990s, I was still like, we're in the Cold War. Now what happens after the Cold War? And that still was very much a US first or a Western first view. But I think two things happened, for which, again, I'm grateful for that inspiration I get for people. The first is living in Birmingham. I grew up in a very segregated city in the United States. Huntsville was very much divided between white and Black Americans. I went to an almost all-white secondary school. I went to an almost all-white university in Nashville, Tennessee. But we also, we had no mosque, so to speak, in Huntsville that I knew about. We only had a very small synagogue. I didn't really have that experience of different faiths and different peoples until I came to Birmingham. Then my children were going to a school with people of many different backgrounds, many racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds. And that taught me there's a completely different perspective than the way I grew up. My children see the world through very different eyes because of that, and I'm thankful for it. And the second part, Ahmed, really was the Iraq War of 2003. And that is that disastrous war, that horrible, terrible war, in which hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in the aftermath of it. And the consequences of it are so far beyond, an individual, beyond a Saddam Hussein, beyond a George W. Bush. It just completely tore the place apart. How did we get there? And I think to learn that, it was like, I need to start learning about what people in these areas experience, whether it's Iraq or Palestine, or then later on, as I began to develop more as a journalist with this site called EA Worldview, let's have a site that covers the news, not from Washington or London, but from Syria, from Iran, from Pakistan. What do people want there? What are their hopes, their fears, their concerns, rather than saying, let's start with the president of the United States or the guy in 10 Downing Street.
So this bias, Western privilege that many of us living in the West, living in Britain, the United States, European countries get accused of, it's not just a bias or a privilege that you can level at the foot of governments, then, is it, Professor Scott Lucas? It's something that revolves even around the individual and how we think of things and how we view the world and how we tell the story of the world to other people.
It revolves around our communities and whether our communities are seen. And it just so happens, I mean, those folks out there who've gone through school, who've gone even, say, to university, where do your textbooks come from? You know, and in many cases, in US and UK universities, you know, those textbooks all came from Americans, or they all came from British authors. If in 1991, at the time of the first Gulf War between the US and Iraq, CNN had a slogan, which was, "We keep America on top of the world." And at that point, the media system, this 24/7 media system, was very much an American media system with elements like the BBC in it. It wasn't until you got Al Jazeera Arabic and then Al Jazeera English that you had like an international global media system, which was representing the world from a different perspective. Now, the advantage of the internet now is we have this opportunity that I didn't have growing up to choose our perspectives. We can choose our different media outlets. We can choose our different communities to look at, whether it's Asia, Africa, the Middle East, or Latin America. But that also brings challenges. Because even though you can view these communities, how do you do it without bias, without prejudice? And how can you do it separating information from disinformation?
Most certainly. We're in a very fascinating conversation with Professor Scott Lucas, Professor of International Relations, editor of EA Worldview, nowadays a prestigious fellow with the Clinton Institute and many other bodies. And he's speaking to us about his life, his journey, from the United States to the United Kingdom. And we were reflecting upon the bias that many of us, all of us, have within us. And how do we deal with that bias? How do we open up our own mindset, open up our own world? And how do we ensure that the view of the world that we have is not tainted by bias, however innocent that bias may be? We are in this fascinating conversation, and we'd love you to join it as well. If you've got a question for Professor Scott Lucas, please call us 01924 231 083. Contact us on WhatsApp, Twitter, whatever you like. We'd love to hear from you. We'll be back right after this break. Stay tuned. Back after this. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Behind the Headlines here on British Muslim TV, the show where we interview inspirational guests about their life, their story, the aim being, the objective being to inspire you and motivate you in the wonderful fields that you yourself can enter and explore. In conversation with Professor Scott Lucas, an acclaimed academic, professional journalist, commentator, someone who has been active in being a voice for so many around the world who seldom have a voice. And I welcome you back to the program, Professor Scott Lucas. You were born in the United States, the land of opportunity, the land of hope and glory, the land of the free man and free woman to do whatever they wanted to do. Then why would you want to come to this little island? Why would you decide to make England your home, Britain your home?
Well, I tell my wife, who's from the great town of Macclesfield in the Northwest, it's because the women are prettier over here. But beyond that domestic answer, I want to be careful here, because a lot of people, you know, can hear a story like that and they think, oh, you left the United States because it's a terrible place and it's like, it's awful. And America has been the source of so many bad things in the world. And we get into that false binary of sort of casting, you know, places as good versus bad. And for me, it's not. There are many great things about America. I think it's a very exciting place to live. It's a very, my hometown wasn't very exciting to grow up, but there are many towns in America where the life, the culture is fascinating. Even after moving here, I went back and spent a period of time in Boston in the United States, and I love Boston. But I think when I came here, again, I came at the age of 18 for a year, and then I came back at 21 to do a postgraduate degree, to study in London. Yes. And it wasn't that I just liked life in London. There were things that I did like. I liked the proximity. I felt like I was closer to the world in the UK than I was in the US. An ironic thing to say after Brexit, I know, but still, I felt closer to Europe. I felt the National Health Service, I felt was a big benefit here. You know, America still doesn't have a full, complete national health system. And as I grew up and as I had a family, I felt reassured by that. I like the fact there's gun control here. There are a lot of guns in America. There's a lot of violence in America. And I think gun control is a serious issue. But I think the thing that, you know, as I get a job and as you get a mortgage and you get kids, I felt like I was almost going through a second, as it were, life or education, learning about different peoples and different cultures. Mm. And I think even today in the UK, and I've now been here, goodness gracious me, for almost getting on for more than 35 years, I still learn each day because of that. It's not just an England or a United Kingdom. There are peoples from so many different backgrounds here who have so many stories to tell that I think you do have this opportunity to reach out within your communities and take you beyond that community to learn about other lives and other perspectives.
You are someone who has always been outspoken on issues of international affairs. Where there's injustice, you'll call it out. And unlike academics who are very good at perhaps writing books and journals and stick to that, you're someone who really puts yourself out there. You've never said no to coming on programs like this and in speaking about issues that are important to communities. Do you worry that perhaps as an academic you have at times been too outspoken? Have you felt as though you've limited your own progression by being outspoken on issues concerning the Middle East and other topics where there's so many players, so many people involved, and you got the risk of offending a lot of people?
Well, I mean, again, as part of the personal narrative, it came to a point, and I love being in academia. I love teaching. I love meeting students. I love meeting people at the university, you know, when we have like gatherings to discuss current affairs. But in academia, you could wait months, even years, for a book or for an article to appear. And so as we were getting into the run-up of 2003, the Iraq War, which I thought was going to be this disastrous event, I wanted to be able to make my voice heard on a day-to-day basis. So I went back to journalism at that point. I wrote for a couple of British publications. I then started, you know, my own site, you know, the site that's now EA Worldview. And my opinion on this is, Ahmed, is that it's, okay, maybe if I'm outspoken, the question is, am I speaking with respect? Am I speaking with respect to the facts? And am I speaking with respect to those with whom I'm in dialogue? And I think if I can say I'm doing those two things, I'm happy with it. I think with so many of the issues that you and I have discussed, you know, we've discussed India and Pakistan, we've discussed Israel and Palestine, we've discussed the conflict in Syria, we discussed the conflict in Yemen. You know, these are difficult stories to cover, and it's very easy to get into the idea of I'm right, you're wrong. And I think if we can discuss and be outspoken while listening to the other side, that's a step forward. I don't think academics live in an ivory tower. I think that's an unjust accusation to try to shut them down. But I think the idea is that academia is not separate from the community. It's not separate from journalism, but it's not separate from our day-to-day lives. And the more that we can bring each of our expertise, and I have expertise in some areas, I'm lucky to have it. You have expertise in some areas, your viewers have expertise. The more we're outspoken with each other, maybe we find a better way forward than what we've seen in recent years.
When you've seen the world going more and more to various extremes, you mentioned the Iraq War, and many people comment on, you know, 1 million people took to the streets of London and the streets of many other cities around the world, demanding that the government of that day do not go into Iraq, do not enter this very terrible war, that the consequences of which, as you say, are clear before us today, and many of which we don't know, many of which we do, others we don't. How did you see your role in those significant international events? Where did you see yourself as an academic? Because I've interviewed a lot of academics over the years, and they'll very much give you the both sides and stay pretty middle of the road on certain things. Where did you see yourself? Was there a conflict between Scott Lucas, the academic, and Scott Lucas, the journalist?
No, it wasn't about me, at least from what I saw. It was about what was going to happen to Iraqis who were going to face an invasion, which for whatever intention was there to get rid of Saddam Hussein, was not going to necessarily lead to the welfare of those people in Iraq. They were going to suffer from it. That it was going to be a conflict which was going to have repercussions through the Middle East and beyond in terms of the way that we approached these very difficult issues, these issues of when you have, people who are being repressed, but on the other hand, you have governments who lie and are willing to lie about things like weapons of mass destruction without regard to the consequences. So it wasn't about me. You just referred to the fact it was about all of us. And I can remember a saying that gave me a silver lining coming out of that, because I saw what was going to happen, which was a journalist named Peter Kellner said about that march in London that I was part of, with 1.5 million people in London. Well, it won't stop this war, but it might stop the next one. And I think the irony is that it wasn't that easy. It wasn't that clean. And what we had is several years later that as the world moves, as the kaleidoscope turns, you still have the issue that there wasn't necessarily a war over Palestine, but the situation had not been resolved there. And that in country after the Middle East, when people rose up against unjust rulers, repressive rulers, rulers who commit war crimes, there were some people who said, oh, we can't help those people. We can't help those people because it's just like Iraq 2003. And I was thinking, no, it's not. Syria 2011 and beyond is not like Iraq 2003. Yemen is not like Iraq 2003. So it's not a question of learning from history so we don't repeat it. It's a question of not falling into simplistic explanations from history. We've got to go to the ground because the situation changes there, and we've got to learn. So that's not about me. That's about, I'm just one person with a lot of other people who just are thinking, how can we make things better? And if you may, there's always points of inspiration that out of that horrible conflict in Iraq, one of a person who worked with me, who was a PhD student, is an Iraqi refugee who now is an esteemed academic here in the UK. That one of my PhD students, now a close friend, is a refugee from Syria, from Damascus, who is now an academic in the UK, teaching others about their experiences, not just about books, to say, let's make it better the next time around.
And when you speak, when you are that voice in an array of confusion, of strong feelings, of international players involved in these conflicts and these crises, are you ever afraid of speaking out? Do you ever worry about speaking out on certain things? Or do you find that you've got that freedom, that maturity in terms of your own experience and your own work, that you've got that license to speak on these issues?
I think maybe because it's old, and if I can use a Southern American phrase, ornery, I don't worry about speaking out now. It's a question of that, I say my opinions. I try to say them respectfully. I try to listen to what the other person says. But to look over my shoulder and say, what does somebody else think about this on social media? What does someone else think about this who, might listen in on what I'm saying somehow? I don't want to live my life that way, but I think there's something beyond it, which I've learned. That is, it's part of the job on a day-to-day basis. And a part of the job as an individual, I guess, for me, that, I'm looking at activists in Belarus right now. There was another one who was murdered on Monday, who was murdered because he was trying to protect the right to speak out. He was trying to protect dissidents. I look at activists who are in the Middle East, some of whom were my friends, some of whom have died, who were in Syria, who were in Iraq, who were in Palestine, and they have spoken out. They've taken the risk and they paid the price for it. I've people in Central America who spoke out against repression that took place there, people in Russia today who are speaking out and carrying great risk about it. If they can take the risk to their lives, if they can take the risk and march on the streets to be decent, to be tolerant, to be better, then why I can't be silent? You know, it means I'm sitting there and letting them take all the cost.
Sure.
So no, I think we speak in support of those who are looking for a better way, who are looking for all of us to be decent to each other.
We are in conversation with Professor Scott Lucas, an acclaimed academic, journalist, commentator, someone who has done a huge amount in his life and continues to do so. We'll be back right after this break. Please stay tuned and please send through your questions. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Behind the Headlines. We are in a very interesting conversation with the acclaimed academic and journalist, Professor Scott Lucas, editor of EA Worldview, professor of international relations, professor of American and Canadian politics, a man who has been at the heart of so many historic events that have unfolded right before his eyes. He has been the spokesperson for so many around the world who haven't got a voice, and we're really learning more about his life, how his thoughts have evolved over the years, how his journey in life has changed over the years. A very fascinating story indeed. Now, Professor Scott Lucas, you spoke about the importance of looking at the world through as many people's eyes as you can, understanding it in all of its diversity. When you have looked at the various disasters around the world, we've seen the worst of humankind. We've seen the Iraq War, the Syrian Civil War, the terrible atrocities we saw in the uprising in Iran. Did any of these events bring you back to your childhood, in the sense that you spoke about growing up in America that was deeply divided, deeply segregated, fiercely discriminatory? Do you think that even though these countries like the US, the UK, our nations have made advances, do we still have that regressive policy makeup in us, not necessarily in the country itself, but in terms of our actions abroad as countries?
What a wonderful question. I think the first thing is, as you know, you learn from people in other countries, you learn what they go through. I think back in a way how lucky I was to grow up in the United States. And I don't mean lucky in the sense that unfortunately some Americans are, which is like, USA, that as a boy, like, it's great we're in the USA because people in Russia, or in the Soviet Union, their children get taken away from their parents. I don't mean it in that kind of, silly nationalistic way. I think I mean it in the way that with all the issues within the American system, and you've mentioned, for example, the question about racism and civil rights, that you had an American system which allowed for the space, at least in the past, for progress. You had space, where people could make economic livelihoods. You've had space there where people could, after fighting long, difficult battles through the courts and through the political system, you could get advances in civil rights. It's not a journey that's complete by any means, as we've seen last summer with the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter marches, but you could see the possibilities that were there in America. And just the fact that America had such an abundance of resources. I didn't come from a well-off family. I came from a relatively poor family, in fact. But still, compared to many people in many parts of the world, we had enough to eat, we had shelter, we had education. I was able to go to a very good university and then go to the United Kingdom and make my life there. And so I think when you look back on it, you think in a way, there's two lessons of that. The first is that I think it makes me think more that instead of this being America first, USA, 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 you need to look at other countries and think of how much people are fighting just to get to the starting point where I was when I was a kid growing up, just to get healthcare, just to get education, and therefore how much we need to support that effort from wherever we are. But I think the second lesson is this. Looking back on my own country, I look at it with a great deal of concern these days Despite the fact that Donald Trump is not in the White House, America is a much more polarized country in which the system is creaking. It's an imperfect system, but it is a system which had set itself up there to protect the rights of many people, to protect the participation of many people. And you have many Americans, when they are willing to attack their Capitol building on behalf of a man who, let me be honest with you, lies, when they are willing to say that an election was illegal and fraudulent, when in fact it was a legitimate election on behalf of a man who lies, that's when you know that no country has a democracy which is beyond the need for protection, including in this country.
And when you see those extremes coming to the forefront in not just the United States, but many nations around the world, where do you think that moderation, where do you think that middle ground comes from? Because let's be honest, many people have lost trust in politicians. Many people have even lost trust in journalists and commentators after what they read and the bias that exists among some journalists and commentators. Where do people find that moderation, that middle ground?
It comes from us. I mean, it can come from us in terms of our religious beliefs, and I'm talking about the positive side of religion, of respect, of tolerance, of engagement to look for a better way, not for a more powerful way. It comes from us in terms of talking about what we want from, for our lives, for the lives of our children. It comes not from saying, I think this, I think that, but from asking the other person, what do you think? What concerns you? Because at the end of the day, I don't think it matters what racial background we come from, what ethnic background we come from, what religion we adhere to. We all are joined by the fact that we want homes, that we want decent health care if we get ill, that we want education for our children, that we want good jobs that we enjoy, that we want places we can congregate that are clean, that have an environment which contributes to our health rather than threatening it. And once you ask someone that, what is it you want? What is it you need? A lot of what divides us falls away. Many of the conflicts you and I have talked about, let us be honest, religion is infused in many of those conflicts because people set up a notion of religion versus religion.
Yes.
There is a contest over territory when in fact we share the same space and it's not yours and mine, it's all of us together. And our leaders, if we depend on our leaders doing that, quite often they're first and foremost out in it for themselves, for power. It starts with us speaking truth to power and speaking truth to each other.
What's the most difficult thing that you've ever done, Professor Scott Lucas?
I think maybe the most difficult moment as a journalist, and there have been many difficult ones. It was difficult covering Iran because, I had many friends that were involved looking for a better way in 2009 in those protests, and I got shut down. It was difficult having acquaintances and friends who were in Gaza and in the West Bank, and friends in southern Israel who have lived under violence, and in the case of Palestine, lived without the ability to have a state. But I think the most difficult was I woke up on the morning of August the 21st, 2013, and I was setting up EA Worldview for the day. And we cover Syria on a day-to-day basis. And I woke up to the news, including from some of my friends and my contacts, that the Assad regime had dropped sarin, which is a deadly nerve agent, on at least 7 sites. It now is up to a dozen possibly, as we find out more and more about it, on these people, these civilians. More than 1,400 people died that day. And I watched it. I watched it as the videos came in, as the photos come in, and desperately finding out where people were. And I think that was perhaps the most difficult moment, because you realize that everything we fight for, how quickly it can change. I think at a personal level, the moment that almost matches that was I was teaching in China about US foreign policy and about all the not just the good things, but the bad things about US foreign policy. And I was teaching about the US and China and had a great session with 300 students. And I came back and someone shouted at me from the place where I was staying, the White House is on fire. Well, it wasn't the White House that was on fire. It was the Pentagon that was on fire. And indeed, it was the World Trade Centers that were on fire on September 11th, 2001. I was in China when it happened. And it wasn't just, seeing a place in a country where I grew up, where thousands of people would die. We had students from the United Kingdom that were on their way to their exchange year abroad in the United States. They were in the air. We didn't know if they were safe. We didn't know if they were on those planes. They could well have been. Now, in the end, luckily, they all were. There were a lot of phone calls that night, so we found out where they were. But for the sake of a person, for whatever reason, and I'm taking this beyond the US and the Middle East, whatever, that person, for whatever reason, who thought, I'm just going to attack these people, happen to be in the United States because of some belief I have. No belief is worth killing your fellow man. No belief is worth killing thousands of your fellow men, whether it was in New York City and Washington on that day in 2001, or in those areas outside Damascus in Syria in 2013.
Absolutely. And these events that you refer to, Professor Scott Lucas, personally moving for yourself, and events that have defined the way in which our world has formed and become in the years that have passed, the issues and challenges that have been faced by many of our viewers, the British Muslim community, in terms of Islamophobia, as a result of those terrorists, extremists and fundamentalists who do not represent Islam in any way, shape or form, or Muslims in any way, shape or form, and indeed the challenges that have been for the victims of terrorism, of all forms, extremism, fundamentalism, and how they now live their lives, how they move forward. You're telling their story, Professor Scott Lucas. How do you cope? How do you keep on going? Because I speak to so many journalists who have worked in the war room of a number of broadcast entities, and some of them just feel like they need to give up because they simply cannot take any more. What's your coping mechanism?
There's one coping mechanism, which is just very, very close to home, and I hope it speaks to your viewers. I have an incredibly wonderful wife who puts up with a lot of my disorganization and the fact that I can be quite absent-minded and the fact that I spend way too much time on social media in pursuit of the job that I do. And she still loves me for it. And she still bolsters me each and every day. We enjoy the good days, we get through the bad days. I've got 2 children who are now adults, who are now living their adult lives and doing wonderful things. I've got family in the United States. I've got an incredible family. I've got a niece who is she has a heart condition. She is the only person with this heart condition who has made it past a year, and she has just celebrated her 20th birthday. Wow. And so it's those personal things that you reach out for. But then beyond that, I keep going because all of you keep going.
That's absolutely beautiful, Professor Scott Lucas. We're going to go to this break, but we're going to continue right after this. We're in conversation with Professor Scott Lucas. We'll be back right after this break. Get your questions in. We'd love to hear from you. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to what you believe is already the final part of Behind the Headlines here on British Muslim TV. We're in a fascinating conversation with acclaimed academic, professional journalist, Professor Scott Lucas. And we were speaking to him about his greatest challenges in life and how he copes with all the work that he does, documenting some of the most difficult scenes that we see around the world. Looking at them on your television screen is hard enough, but actually telling that story, being that voice, is even more difficult. Professor Scott Lucas, recently you have retired from the day job in the sense that you're no longer someone who's at a university specifically. You've now diversified into doing more of this and more speaking. Tell us about that transition, because we left you at 2003, where you started to get more active in journalism. How has that transition come about?
Well, I had a great career at the University of Birmingham. Loved every moment at it, but came up to the end of last year, 2020, and I had the chance to move on. And I said, yeah, it's time to, because there were new projects. There's always something that's out there. And so, for example, I work closely with another university, or specifically the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin, which is an institute which very much looks at, quote, America, but not just America. It's America and the rest of the world, how we interact with each other.
Professor Scott Lucas, I hate to pause you there, but no better time than if you mention America. Absolutely, so much to talk about there. We've got a caller online, so I want to take this call, if we may. Assalamu alaikum, good evening. What's your name and where are you calling from, please?
Hello, evening. I just wanted to speak to Scott Lucas.
Yes, he can hear you. What's your name? Where are you calling from, please?
Scott Lucas, I wanted to say that when you're saying about journalism, most of journalism nowadays is scripted, and you don't have people like Snowden and Julian Assange. And when you say about September 11, we all know what the truth is about the cult that controls and psychopaths that control the world.
Thank you very much for your call there. Everybody has their views, and of course, so far as 9/11 is concerned, this horrific terrorist attack, deplorable atrocity that cost the lives of so many people and injured many more, an utterly deplorable attack that we've got to be absolutely clear on. But on journalism, Professor Scott Lucas, the caller did mention about journalists often working on scripts. And how do you move away from that? How do you have the flexibility to speak as you want to speak and tell the story as you want to tell it?
Well, that's part of why, as we were discussing, I made the move from Birmingham to other projects. So when I work with the Clinton Institute, one of the things that is starting at the Clinton Institute in January is a CNN Academy. Now, your folks may have various views on CNN, but it's the opportunity to actually work with people linking up an academic program with journalism. And CNN doesn't control that program. I'm the one who gets to teach and work with students on it. So that's one way of influencing. There's another way of influencing, which is I'm involved with, of course, EA Worldview on a day-to-day basis, and we're expanding. And when I work with people around the world, in a sense, many of us are journalists. Many of us have events that we want to talk about, that we want to discuss, that we want to write about. And EA Worldview allows me to connect with those citizen journalists, and has done for many years. I just can expand it now. Or there's a new project. I'm linked up with people in Turkey, not the Erdogan government, other people in Turkey, on something called Deep Dive Politics. I host a video series called World Unfiltered to talk to activists, to talk to practitioners, to talk to journalists who are not reading off scripts. What do they see from Turkey or the Middle East or Central Asia? I'm working with a new project which launches this week called the Kremlin File, which is to examine Russia and to examine how Russia has influenced the world and continues to influence it. So in other words, I know why it's very easy for us to put people in boxes and to say, well, this president is here, this prime minister is there, this journalist is there. That's why I say, get beyond the boxes and talk to each other the way that you and I are talking right now. And then we not only have a different perspective, we empower ourselves. So we aren't at the dependence of others to tell us what's happening. We can make a difference ourselves.
And you made that transition yourself from the University of Birmingham, where you were for many, many decades. You've seen so many students come through those doors. You've educated many of them. You've mentored many of them. And as you said, so many, including refugees from Syria, people from Iran, have now come over, become academics themselves, and they're telling their story. What would you say to people who think academia sounds super complicated and you've got to be a very intelligent person to get your head around it? Is there a place for British Muslims, many of our viewers watching, young people, those who are not so young even, in academia?
If that's where you want to be, Absolutely. Each of your viewers out there will have skills, they'll have passions, there'll be things that they want to pursue. Do it if you can. And of course, we know there's issues of money, there's issues of time and all of that. But the more that you can reach out and find someone that can help you pursue that, absolutely. Too often, when we think about academia in this country, or at least the way I thought about it, we think about Oxford and Cambridge. I almost wound up at Cambridge. Fortunately for me, I had a different experience. I wound up at a university in London. That's where my path was. Because the UK isn't just Oxford and Cambridge, and it isn't just upper class elite, I'll say it here, white people. It's people from all different kinds of backgrounds. And there are many paths, many schools, many universities and colleges. It's just a case of finding the one that is best for your path to pursue it. And it's a case of reaching out. I'll say to each of your viewers out there, anyone, if I can help in any way, if you have a dream that you want to pursue and it involves academia, contact me. Contact folks like Ahmad out there, because it's because of knowing how much other people have helped me and how much my students have helped me on a day-to-day basis that, look, if in any way we can pursue this, well and good. Let me close with this. Quite often we hear about people at the top who don't open up doors for different people of race, religion, and background. We know what our current prime minister has said, for example, about Muslims in the past. That's his view. It's unfortunate. But you know what? He's just one guy who happens to be in 10 Downing Street. There are a lot of people with different views, decent views, whether it's about Muslims, Jews, Christians, people who are secular. And it's those people I want to pay attention to. And it's those people I want to connect with.
Professor Scott Lucas, are we going backwards in the sense that you saw the brutal effects of segregation growing up in the United States? You saw in certainly the south of the United States the huge discrimination that existed. Those same barriers, perhaps not as overt, people find when they apply for jobs, when they apply to even particular universities sometimes. Nurseries, there's even a story out now where there's an allegation that babies, literally toddlers, are being discriminated against because of their names. Are we as a society in need of going through that journey that we've been through for a number of decades to get to a place of moderation? Do we have to do that again now?
Our race is never run. The Quran tells us the race is never run. There is no end point. My reading of the Bible, it's not the Revelation's apocalyptic vision. It's I think a more decent view in the New Testament is that our race is never run. There are always challenges for us to meet. There are always challenges to overcome, and there will be setbacks. There will be those who aren't necessarily with us on the journey, but stand in the way, whether it's for reasons of power, reasons of discrimination, reasons of ignorance. But in some ways, Ahmed, for me, it's the running of the race that matters. When I saw after the death of George Floyd last year, those people who peacefully marched, and the vast majority peacefully marched to find a better way in America, that was a start. When I see those in Palestine who continue to try to pursue an education, to try to pursue their communities after decades of being denied the political power to have that race continues. And in our own communities, I realize that the harsh words that often mark so much of political life, think of the many kind words, viewers, that you hear from each other that may not make it to a national newspaper, may not make it from the lips of the prime minister, but there are kind words that are said. Think of the graduation ceremonies of your children from primary school, secondary school, possibly beyond. Think about those who serve in the healthcare system, in the police, working in our shops, and think about how each and every day they do that to make this a more decent place and keep running the race.
Professor Scott Lucas, it's been an absolute pleasure and honor having you on the program. Thank you very much for joining us and sharing with us your life story, your journey from the United States of America, growing up in that small town, and as you said, a bit of a lonely existence to now really raising your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations, and opening your own horizons with the support of so many people. And now to see you do that for other people is truly inspirational. We're really grateful for your time today on the program, Professor Scott Lucas.
The honor has been mine. Peace to you and all your listeners and all your viewers.
And to you. Thank you so much. And a really powerful message there from Professor Scott Lucas, dear viewers, that no matter what adversity you face, whether it's those who are suffering persecution around the world. This week saw 2 years since the lockdown in occupied Kashmir. We see in many nations around the world where people's rights are denied, where basic human dignity is denied, where even the right of being a citizen of a country that you and your people have been in for many decades and many centuries, the Rohingya people, for example, is right before our eyes. But then on the other level, as Professor Scott Lucas said, we all face our own challenges in our daily lives. They're not quite as severe, thank God, as the challenges that we speak of persecution and tyranny, but they are significant. They are sometimes even debilitating. But the most important message that Professor Scott Lucas said, and I took from what he said, was that don't be afraid to reach out. Reach out for support, achieve your dreams and your aspirations. If you think the sky is a limit, you've got limited imagination. We'll be back next week. Till then, Assalamu alaikum.